They were warriors forged in fire, long before they bore gene seed. When the Emperor came to claim Terra, he did not simply conquer, he calculated, absorbed, and redirected. Old Albia was not destroyed, it was repurposed. But the question remains, did the soul of that ancient realm ever truly yield? To truly understand the origins of the 14th Legion, who eventually would become the Dusk Raiders and later the Death Guard, one must look back into the brutal fires of the Unification Wars and the shadowed legacy of a realm known as Old Albia. Before Terra flew a single banner, Old Albia had stood as a realm of towering industry and iron-willed warrior clans. Seated deep in the northern Atlan wilderness on the continent once called Europa, it was here among soot-blackened cities and martial enclaves that some of the most enduring bloodlines of the pre-imperial Terra were born. Clans as old as the strife they perpetuated. These were people hardened by centuries of war against both invaders and each other. Their loyalty was to blood, iron, conquest, but not ideology. When the Emperor initiated the creation of the Legions Astartes, the strength of such lineages could not be ignored. The first wave of gene recruits for the nascent 14th Legion were drawn predominantly from Old Albia. So fruitful was this source that its warrior stock was also siphoned, albeit to a lesser degree, in order to fill the ranks of both the Iron Hands and the Night Lords, the 10th and 8th Legions, respectively. But it was the 14th who were shaped most deeply by Albia, by its culture, its scars, and its refusal to kneel. The Emperor's decision to recruit from this hostile yet highly capable population was born not purely of pragmatism, but from a greater strategic motive. Though Albia had pledged allegiance to the Unification War, it had once rivaled the Emperor himself for dominion over Terra's destiny. By drawing their brightest and most dangerous into the Imperial war machine as a whole, the Emperor not only harvested peerless warriors, but he also ensured that those same warriors could never again pose a threat from within. His second aim was far more subtle, but lo and behold, no less vital. Albia's military legacy was vast. Its warlords and soldier scientists had already overthrown the crumbling remnants of the Pan-Pacific Empire, toppling the descendants of the once so-called unspeakable king, Northan Doom. These men and women carried with them the same ancient arsenal of martial doctrines and genetic potential, which were assets that the Emperor would not waste. By subsuming their martial traditions into the Legions Astartes, the Emperor preserved their brutal efficiency while redirecting their loyalty towards his own vision of mankind. Yet assimilation was not immediate. When the forces of the Unification War marched north, they were met not with submission, but with outright war and unending resistance. The Albians, proud and unyielding, refused to exchange one overlord for another. Against the Emperor's Thunder Warriors, they deployed steam-belching proto-dreadnoughts, heavily armored Ironside battalions, and advanced battlefield tactics honed over centuries. Engagement after engagement saw Imperial forces dissolve. With each Albion defeat, the Emperor was drained of mountains of resources. It was not fear that stalled the Emperor's hand, but respect, as he recognized in Albians not just resistance, but value. Crushing them utterly would demand a grinding war of attrition, yielding only ash where he sought foundation. Instead, he offered a ceasefire and extended the hand of negotiation. And remarkably, the warlords of Albia answered not with capitulation, but with agreement. Thus was born the first tradition of the 14th Legion, the Dusk Raiders, shaped in the tumult of Albia, blood-bound to a past they did not fully relinquish, and tempered by the hand of the Emperor himself. They would carry traditions of their forebearers into the stars, not as warlords, but as warriors of the Imperium. Should you find this report enlightening, make sure it is known to the Ordo Algorithmus by engaging with the transmission through comments, hitting the like button, and subscribing to ensure continued access to sanctioned knowledge. There are moments in history when a single decision alters the trajectory of an empire, not through conquest, but through restraint. What followed the Emperor's visit to Old Albia remains one such turning point, one cloaked in silence and marked by transformation, then echoed in every bolter round fired in his name. Against the counsel of his most seasoned generals and strategists, the Emperor of Mankind chose diplomacy over domination. Clad not in battle plate, but in simple robes of white and crimson, he walked alone into the warlords' parliament of Old Albia, a place where oaths had been sworn and sealed in iron and betrayal reaped in blood. Unarmed, he addressed them directly. What was offered was not simply an alliance, but absolution. The Emperor spoke of a reborn humanity, free of tyrants, united under one banner, and unshackled from the cycles of internecine war. His vision, ambitious and absolute, promised not only glory amongst the stars, but redemption for generations of kinslaying and tribal vendettas. To the astonishment of his own retinue and the silence of imperial command, the Albian warlords unanimously accepted. Joining the Imperium, Old Albia did not vanish, but rather it evolved. The clans, long considered to be too dangerous to trust, became some of the most fervent supporters of imperial unification. They yielded their ancient secrets, their forges, and most critically, their sons, offered willingly to become the first Astartes of the nascent 14th Legion. From the outset, this legion bore a martial character distinctly coded in the Albian traditions. Their tactics mirrored those of their Ironside ancestors, methodical, disciplined, and brutal. These warriors were not built to maneuver or outflank. They were designed to endure. Clad in unadorned grey power armor, they served as the Imperium's hammer, capable of holding the line or breaking through an enemy with sheer grinding attrition. In defense, they were unmovable, standing shoulder to shoulder beneath storms of unending fire, willing to fight to the last bolter shell, the last breath. In offense, they were remorseless, delivering wave after wave of assault, excelling in close-range engagement where the cost in blood was steepest. Their advance was not swift, but inevitable. As their legend grew, so did their heraldry. Their previous plain armor began to carry marks of rank and modifications drawn from ancient Ironside iconography. A quiet nod to the legacy they never fully abandoned. More tellingly, they painted their right vambrace, gauntlet, and pauldron all in a deep crimson, the color of drying blood. What once had marked the merciless reach of the unspeakable king and his enforcers now proclaimed the right hand of the Emperor's justice. Their name too was forged in battle, as in the final campaigns of Terran unification became the first forays into the Great Crusade, the 14th Legion gained an epitaph from those who had survived their assault. Said epitaph was the Dusk Raiders, and it was not a title they resented, but rather they embraced. The name was drawn from an Albian tactic, striking at twilight, when the shifting light would confound the senses and sentries of their enemies, all the while they would advance cloaked in darkness. At dusk, the enemy's vigilance would wane the most, and it was there, in that fragile threshold between day and night, that the Dusk Raiders would excel. Such was the reputation of the 14th Legion that even before the first bolt was fired, enemies, given the choice to surrender to the Dusk Raiders, often faltered. In the twilight hours, when their arrival was signaled, not by horns, but by the sudden retreat of the sun, enemy garrisons would unravel. Reports tell of defenders abandoning fortified positions en masse, some casting down arms in a panic, others fleeing blindly into the wilderness, all to avoid the unyielding advance of these grey armored warriors. The Dusk Raiders had become a symbol, not just of victory, but of an inevitable defeat. And yet, as brutal as they were on the field, the Dusk Raiders carried themselves with a rigid, almost austere sense of honor. When the terms of surrender were met in good faith, they adhered to them without hesitation. Symbols of truce were respected. When a foe yielded early and was deemed worthy of imperial compliance, they were spared annihilation. To those who bent the knee, the Dusk Raiders were not reapers, but redeemers. But that honor has limit. To the aberrant, the mutant, and the Xenos, there would be no mercy, no quarter, no negotiation. In these instances, the same steadfast will that upheld their traditions and treaties became a cold doctrine of extermination without pause or pity. When battle was declared in full, and the window for peace closed, there was no force in the stars that could stay the Dusk Raiders' hand. For 8 solar decades, the 14th Legion fought in this manner. As the other legions were reunited with their long-lost gene fathers, the Dusk Raiders remained amongst the few orphaned Astartes without a guiding paternal figure. In that absence, they looked inward. What emerged was a legion entirely self-forged, proud, reserved, and utterly reliable. Their victories multiplied across compliant worlds, each campaign further cementing a reputation that even their brother legions regarded with a mix of admiration and respect. But the day long anticipated would eventually come, the long-delayed return and reunion with their primarch. Unfortunately, this would not deliver the glory or unity others had found. When it came, the event cast not a light but rather a macabre shadow of death over the Legion. What should have been met with celebration became the beginning of the end. The proud traditions and identity of the Dusk Raiders, which they had cultivated for decades on end, were systematically dismantled, reshaped beneath a new vision. The cohesion, heraldry, and even the name all swept away. Under this weight, the Dusk Raiders were not elevated, rather they were erased, and from their remains, only the Death Guard would endure. Some origins are shrouded in silence, while others are buried in ceaseless screams. The investigation into the Death Guard now has us turn to an unlikely location, a hellish planet known in Imperial records as Barbarus, a place cloaked in caustic mist and ruled by powers both ancient and unnatural. It is there that the next chapter of the 14th Legion's transformation begins, with the discovery of their Gene-Sire. On this blighted world, the population had long since fractured into two distinct groups. First, the oppressive beings of immense psychic power and might, along with a mastery over death itself, commonly referred to in scattered records as overlords, though their exact classification remains contested since many Imperial record keepers seem to believe they are just a deviation of humanity, rather than an entirely unique species of Xenos. These necromantic warlords wielded terrifying sorceries and unnatural sciences, commanding undead constructs and mutated thralls to enforce their dominion. The second population was altogether more human. Settlers marooned countless millennia before, reduced to a desperate existence. These valley dwellers lived in perpetual fear, confined to a narrow band of breathable air, in particular terrain where the breathable air settled, and where the noxious fumes of the planet's upper reaches could not penetrate. For generation upon generation, they existed under the heel of their masters, scavenging a living while watching their loved ones stolen to serve as flesh for the overlord's twisted experiments. It was into this world of darkness and despair that one lone infant fell from the skies, a child of unnatural resilience and a destiny beyond mortal comprehension. This child would not be found in safety or shelter, but amongst the dead. Discovered by Nakar, the most powerful of the overlords, the infant was found wailing on a battlefield strewn with corpses, where any other human would have perished in minutes. The child survived, his lungs unbothered by the planet's toxic fog. Cautious, perhaps even impressed, Nakar claimed the boy as his own, naming him Mortarion, in common tongue, child of death. Nakar did not merely adopt Mortarion, he crafted him, as the High Overlord sought not only to groom a successor, but to create a weapon. Mortarion was raised in a towering fortress, at the absolute threshold of his tolerance, ensuring constant suffocating hardship, which would shape the child into something far beyond mortal limits. Meanwhile, Nakar would withdraw to an even higher peak, where not even Mortarion, whose resilience was legendary, would never be able to reach. This was a perch from where he could rule and observe. Rather quickly, Nakar noted that Mortarion grew at an unnatural speed and had an insatiable hunger for knowledge. His intellect was as sharp as a scythe wielded by the warlords of this world. Under Nakar's tutelage, he absorbed everything: the arts of battle, tactics, metallurgy, and even arcane sciences, along with forbidden lore. But this brilliance, Nakar found, would come with an ingrained defiance. As Mortarion's awareness deepened, so did his questions. Questions his father refused to answer. Why were the valley people haunted? Why were the dead not allowed to rest? Why did the overlords require constant suffering to maintain their power? And to these questions, Nakar offered no answers. But Mortarion, child of death and son of war, would not remain silent forever. On the death world of Barbarus, where the skies were thick with corrosive fog and the whispers of the dead, the child came by the necromancer Nakar had grown into something his master never intended: a warrior who would not kneel. Denied answers to his questions, Mortarion, the lost son of the Emperor, made his choice, and in a moment of defiance, when a caravan of valley dwellers was being dragged towards the heights to be subjected to Nakar's grotesque experiments, Mortarion broke the chains of his confinement. He shattered the gates of the fortress he had once called a home, cutting down the undead constructs, guarding it with a cold precision unlike that living beings could normally. At his side at this time was a man named Callus Typhon, one of those he had risked to save at a great cost, who in turn had become a guide. Together, he and his guide descended through the lethal fog and into the valleys below. It was there that Mortarion discovered the truth. The oppressed, the hunted, were his people, not some lesser creatures as Nakar had claimed it to be, but rather humans, his kin. From that moment on, Mortarion swore an oath not of vengeance but of liberation. At the first valley, the people regarded the gaunt, pale giant with suspicion, as he bore the bearing of the mountain lords. Yet none of them had ever come down to help, but fate had delivered him a test. When a pack of mutants, twisted slaves of another overlord, fell upon the village, Mortarion stood with the peasants, a harvesting hand already cruelly and crudely forged in his deadly hand, and with said scythe he carved through the monsters in a brutal silence. The overlord who had sent the beasts watched with arrogant amusement, that is, until Mortarion stepped into the fog itself and just kept coming. Where all others would have succumbed, Mortarion endured and advanced, and so the overlord died, screaming into the very mists he had once ruled. From that day on, Mortarion was no longer a stranger. He was a liberator, a teacher, and a warlord, as he began campaigns not only of war, but of transformation. Village by village, he forged strongholds from hovels, trained farmers to fight, and began to mold survivors of Barbarus into an army, from which he chose the strongest and most enduring to forge into strike teams. This was the genesis of what would become the Death Guard. With blacksmiths and craftsmen by his side, Mortarion directed the construction of armor designed to withstand the deadly atmosphere. Every engagement providing pivotal new data, new lessons onto how to push further into the poisonous height. Together, man and machine were shaped by war and corrosion. And still, one peak stood above all others, the final bastion, the citadel of Decay, and it was within a summit that remained shrouded in toxic winds, too dense even for Mortarion's gene-forged physiology to bear. After years of liberation and grueling warfare, Mortarion stood at the very edge of victory. The peaks of Barbarus, once a citadel of tyranny, had begun to fall to his death guard. Only one remained, the highest and most venomous of the summits, Decay, the man who had raised Mortarion, and the necromantic overlord who still reigned, watched over the proceedings with a mortifying grin. However, Mortarion hesitated. Despite Decay's grotesque cruelty and the years of torment he had wrought, the man had once taken Mortarion and named him Child of Death, shaping him in his later years. Mortarion had planned to storm the field of the final citadel. Despite Mortarion's plans, he would call off the attack. Returning to his capital, Mortarion expected reverence. However, instead he found whispers. The villagers spoke not of his victories, but of a stranger, a radiant figure who had descended from the stars, offering salvation to the world, a world who he had bled to free. In the central hall, the stranger stood amongst the elders, his presence calm but immovable. Mortarion, bristling with defiance, declared the Barbarus required no salvation, but its own, along with the statement that he and his warriors would finish what they had started. The stranger listened, then offered a challenge to the cloaked warlord in measured authority. If you can destroy the High Overlord, he said, I shall leave this world, but if you fail, you will swear your allegiance to me, to the Imperium of man. Pride and honor questioned, Mortarion accepted, against the protests of his closest warriors. He ascended to the Death Shroud peak alone, his purpose now not only conquest, but vindication. He sought to prove himself as stronger than Decay, stronger than the poison that had once bound him, stronger than the very legacy of cruelty. But the summit proved too much. The air in Decay's citadel was a lethal tide. Even Mortarion's customized and upgraded armor, designed through years of adaptation to the planet's wasteland, metal corroded, flesh failed, as Mortarion staggered forward, shouting challenges through collapsed lungs, until, that is, he fell at the very gates of the fortress. In his final moments of consciousness, he saw the towering figure of Decay approaching, a weapon in hand, but before the killing blow could be delivered, a streak of golden flame descended from the skies. The stranger, the one who had dared question Mortarion's strength, intervened. With a single blinding thrust of his sword, Decay was slain by the weapon raised in fire. When Mortarion next awoke, the truth awaited him. The stranger was no mere wanderer. He was the emperor of mankind, his true father by blood and destiny. The orphaned son of Barbarus had been found at last. In recognition of Mortarion's struggle and potential, the Emperor bestowed upon him the command of the 14th Legion, once known as the Dusk Raiders. In reverence to their new primarch, the Legion took upon a new name, the Death Guard, adopting the color and tactic alongside the tendencies forged in the mist-covered crucible of Barbarus. But all was not right. Mortarion had dreamed of years for the moment he would slay Necare with his own hand. That final act of vengeance, his right, his closure, had been stained, and in its place, a debt to a distant godlike father was thrust upon him. Though he bent the knee, the seeds of resentment were buried deep within, and in the soul of Barbarus, such things do not simply wither and die. Excerpt from Mortarion's address to his legion. The war for Barbarus was over, but not without consequence. Mortarion, liberator, warlord, and now son reclaimed, fulfilled his oath to the emperor with solemn fealty. Once sufficiently recovered from his near-fatal state due to his ascent to the poisonous heights of his homeworld, he bent the knee before a being who claimed both his blood and his destiny. But not all wounds fade with time. The physical toll taken during his final confrontation and the psychological weight of having his vengeance denied would leave permanent marks on Mortarion, which were both deep and enduringly agitated. These scars, both visible and unseen, would never truly heal. Despite this, his role in the Emperor's grand design would be swiftly set in motion. Mortarion had already proven himself a master of warfare and doctrine. He was immediately granted command of the 14th Legion, his sons, by both Geneseed and Fate. They had once borne the name Dusk Raiders, a proud Terran force known for their methodical and tenacious fighting style. But what they beheld was now something wholly different. To those Terran-born warriors, their new warlord must have appeared like a specter from old Earth, a myth given form. Gaunt, shrouded in ash-gray robes, a black scythe slung across his back, the very same weapon once wielded by the overlord who had raised him. All in all, he was a living silhouette of death itself, not unlike the Reaper of legends from ancient Terra. Mortarion's first words to them were stark and absolute, as he delivered in a reaping whisper, each syllable somehow cut through the silence like iron on stone, carried with an unnatural clarity to every corner of those assembled legionaries.
You are my unbroken blades. You are the death guard. By your hand shall justice be delivered, and doom shall stalk 1,000 worlds.
With those words, a transformation took place. The Dusk Raiders were officially no more. From that moment forward, the Legion carried a new name, a new moniker, and a new banner. A name steeped with a legacy of survival, endurance, and retribution. The title, Death Guard, was etched above the airlock of their flagship immediately. The Reaper's scythe was a symbol and a vessel that would soon become infamous across the galaxy. And with the strike of a single sentence, their old identity, their old honor, their old self had been buried deep. From then on, all records, all campaigns, and all honors earned and glories won would belong not to the Terran-born Dusk Raiders, but to the Death Guard, a legion reborn in sorrow, forged in defiance, and bound to a master who carried both burden and bitterness in equal measures. In the wake of Mortarion's ascension to command, the 14th Legion, once proud and relentless, began to shift, subtly at first, but then profoundly. Initially comprised almost entirely of Terran-born Astartes, the Legion underwent a radical transformation, following the integration of Barbarus into the Imperium. With Mortarion's firm hand guiding recruitment, new initiates were drawn almost exclusively from the harsh, toxin-choked world that had shaped the Primarch. Amongst the first and most notable of these new warriors was Callus Typhon, a grim and ambitious survivor of Barbarus, who had long served Mortarion as his chief lieutenant during the Liberation Wars and would now be elevated to the rank of first captain. Typhon's rise signaled more than just a simple appointment. It marked the beginning of a cultural divergence within the Legion. The infusion of Barbarus-born neophyte recruits hardened by a lifetime beneath the shadows of necromantic tyrants introduced new beliefs, customs, and a morbid pragmatism alien to their Terran-born brothers. Over time, the traditions of the old Dusk Raiders, steeped in Terran military doctrine and disciplined ritual, began to erode. In their place grew a new warrior culture, one shaped by Mortarion's ascetic philosophy, his disdain for weakness, and grim fatalism, which had been gained in a world ruled by death. By the closing years of the Great Crusade, this divide had deepened into a quiet schism. Tensions simmered beneath the surface as ideological fault lines separated the Terran veterans from the Barbarus-born Astartes. The former clung to the Legion's old roots on Earth, while the latter stood resolutely behind their primarch and the vision he imposed. Tensions would eventually come to a head in the shadow of betrayal. On the eve of the Horus Heresy, Mortarion was forced to confront a bitter truth. Not all of his legion would follow him into rebellion. As the orders were drawn for the purge of Isstvan III, it became evident that nearly 1/3 of the Death Guard were deemed as potentially disloyal. Astartes whose allegiance to the Emperor outweighed even their loyalty to Mortarion. Amongst them were many of Terran origin, warriors who had once been the Dusk Raiders and still bore the values of that era. The most prominent of these deserters was Battle Captain Nathaniel Garrow of the 7th Company. Garrow, a relic of his legion's pre-Barbarus identity, remained fiercely loyal to the Emperor and his vision of unity. His conscience and his honor would not allow him to follow his Gene-Sire into treachery. What followed was not merely a military purge, it was a breaking of a brotherhood.